What is negative space and why is it important in art? Well, the simplest way that I can explain it is that negative space is the area around your subject, kind of that space between the person or thing that you're drawing and the edge of the paper or the border. This green part right here, see all of this space between the border and the subject? That's a lot of empty space, and it's all one continuous space of emptiness, all except for this nice little shape right here between the arm and the face. See that? That's nice. It's a neat little shape, not like all of the rest of this negative space. So what do we do to make the negative space a bit more interesting, less boring? Oh, and sorry this is so far off to the right. I was so into the drawing that I didn't notice I was so far over. There, that's a bit easier to see. Do you see how I shrunk the border to create these wonderful shapes with the negative space? These are fun, they're interesting, the shapes themselves are pleasing to the eye. And I think this is a good time to remind you all, this is art, not science or math. There's no reason to why this is pleasing to the eye other than it is. There are rules in art that were made not in a right and wrong sort of way that rules are usually made, but tried and true things that artists over the last 1,000 years or so have kind of worked out that, well, this seems to make people happy and this doesn't. It's that magical thing that makes art art. So please take these as things to look out for when making art. You can work with negative space or not. This is just one thing like complementary colors or bad tangents that's simply a tool that may or may not make your art more pleasing to look at. That's all. Okay, for this one, let's create negative space shapes by adding the border here and here. And I think it'd be nice if the dress kind of pulled out past the border here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 shapes of negative space now, but what if we added a circle behind her? This should break up the negative space and hopefully make it even more interesting. Now we have 9 shapes that can have texture and different colors, and as an artist, you can have fun defining those shapes if you want. And you'll see that a lot in Art Nouveau. Shapes will fill in the backgrounds, creating new negative space that in turn can be filled with textures or patterns. It's all about finding ways to fill that empty space while also drawing attention to the subject. And negative space doesn't have to be only the space behind your subject. You can have negative space in your subject too. This is one of my favorites. With the right composition and the right subject, you can leave hair or clothing or any shape of your subject to become its own unique design element. Isn't that beautiful? I love how the border is shorter on the left side and longer on the right side. And the way the dress kind of disappears into the border itself is, in my humble opinion, gorgeous. Look, the same subject, same pose, but different use of composition and negative space is just so blah, right? And I'm just gonna point out the bad tangent right here too. Ugh. But that's an easy fix. You just lower the border right here and the piece instantly becomes so much better. Okay, we'll do one more. Sometimes your subject just isn't that interesting. The silhouette of the character is kind of bland. Her costume is really nice, but the overall shape is kind of boring. And centering her in the middle of a box just doesn't help. The only real interesting negative space is in between her arm and her hip here. But what if we moved her to the left of the box? Does that create any better space? Is it any more interesting? No, I don't think so. I think a box isn't the right shape for this subject. Here's where I like to push the aspect of my portrait to something far more interesting. A wider aspect makes it really interesting with her on the left, but there's still a bunch of empty negative space out there. How do we break that up? Well, my favorite way is hair. By making the hair long and flowing in curves and swooshes, we break up the large area of negative space, and in doing so, create new shapes that we can play with. And of course, you can do a cape or people behind her or arches of a window or buildings or anything to break up that boring area behind her. But I think pushing her to the left and having her hair flow to the right is a far more interesting composition than just the original boring silhouette that we had starting off with her. And even looking at this now, we can narrow the border here and that creates even more interesting negative space shapes. See that? That's about all I know when it comes to negative space. I hope it helps. But there are artists who are masters at using negative space not only to make their art more interesting, but they actually use negative space to tell a story. Look at how this artist used negative space between the trees to become the white of the paper of the book, or how the logo of this writing nib uses negative space to create a spoon shape. Get it? They're food writers, so both writing and food. Okay. And how cool is this? Batman and the Penguin? And which one is the negative space and which one is the subject? But that's just fancy schmancy stuff. For now, I hope you just start to look at the space between your subject and the border in a new light. Play with your negative space and hopefully some fun shapes will appear. And I hope that makes your art something that pleases your eye and makes you happy.